Hey guys, tonight we begin with the Ottoman Empire, one of the longest lived and most genuinely strange political experiments in human history, starting with a day in the life of a Janissary soldier who was taken from his family as a child, turned into an elite warrior, and told to be grateful about it. Then we follow Hurrem Sultan, the enslaved woman who became so politically dangerous that the entire Ottoman court spent decades trying to figure out what to do with her, and largely failed. After that, you become an official dragoman, the empire's indispensable interpreter, trusted by everyone and safe with no one. And finally, we pull back the curtain on the Imperial Harem, which was not what anyone outside those walls imagined, and was considerably more alarming. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is. I always like seeing where in the world people are watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. You do not remember the exact day it happened. That is the strangest part looking back. The memory has been worn smooth by too much handling, like a stone pulled from a river so many times that you can no longer see the marks on it. But you remember fragments, the official arriving in the village, the way your mother went very still when she saw who it was, the sound of your father saying nothing at all, which was somehow the loudest thing in the room. You were maybe 10 years old, maybe 11. No one had been precise about that either. This was the Devshirme, the collection, the Ottoman system by which the empire reached into its Christian villages and removed boys, the healthy ones, the bright-eyed ones, the ones who looked like they might become something worth investing in, and took them away to be trained as soldiers and servants of the Sultan. It was, depending on who you ask and when they were asked, a form of slavery, a path to extraordinary power, or both of those things simultaneously in a way that resists clean summary. The boys were converted to Islam, they were educated, they were shaped into something the empire needed, and in return, they received a kind of status that was real and genuine, and also conditioned entirely on their usefulness to a system they had never chosen to enter. That is the world you're waking up in now, not the village. That is already years behind you, softened by time into something that feels more like a dream than a place. You are waking up in the barracks, and the barracks have their own logic, their own language, and their own very specific ideas about what your body is supposed to be capable of by the end of the day. The sound that wakes you is not gentle. It is never gentle. Someone is moving through the room with the energy of a person who has decided that sleep is a personal failing, striking the wooden post at the end of each sleeping mat with something that produces a sound like a complaint being filed against your nervous system. You are upright before you are fully conscious, which is exactly how it was designed. In the Janissary system, the body learns before the mind does. The body learns first and the mind eventually catches up and accepts its new employment. Your mat is thin. It has always been thin. You have occasionally wondered whether there is a thicker version being held in reserve somewhere, a reward for some achievement you have not yet unlocked. There is not. The thinness is not an oversight. It is a philosophy. Comfort in this system is rationed carefully, because comfort makes things difficult to move, and the Janissaries above everything else were designed to move. You stand. Your feet find the cold stone floor and immediately regret it. Around you, the others are doing the same, rising in various states of consciousness, some of them already pulling on their clothes with the smooth efficiency of people who have done this so many times that the movement has stopped requiring thought. You watch them for a moment. That efficiency is what you are here to become. You are not there yet. You are still the version of yourself that notices the cold. The room is long and shared and smells of many people who spent the night in close proximity. This is not surprising. What is slightly surprising even now is how quickly you have stopped noticing it. Human beings adapt to almost anything given enough time and sufficient lack of alternatives. You have adapted to the smell. You have adapted to the noise. You have adapted to the structure that organizes every hour of your day into something that serves a purpose you were not consulted about. The one thing you have not entirely adapted to is the food, but you are working on it. Breakfast in the Janissary barracks is a collective experience, which sounds warmer than it is. You file into the long hall with the others, and the meal that appears before you is filling in the way that a stone wall is filling. It occupies the space. It does not delight. Soup first, usually lentil, thick and heavy, and tasting of absolutely nothing in particular except the vague commitment to keeping you upright. Then bread, always bread. The bread here is real bread, proper bread which sounds like faint praise but is not. You have learned that real bread, reliably available, is not something to take for granted. You know boys who grew up with considerably less certainty about their next meal than you have here. That is one of the strange truths of this life. It gives you things, it takes other things, and the accounting of what was given and what was lost depends entirely on where you started. You eat without speaking. The rule during meals is silence, or something close enough to silence that conversation feels like an act of minor rebellion. You have learned to eat quickly and efficiently, which is different from eating with pleasure, but serves the same biological function. Around you, dozens of other young men are doing the same, their faces arranged in the particular expression of people concentrating on something that should not require concentration. The soup is hot. You're grateful for that, quietly, internally, in a way you would not announce. After breakfast comes the morning prayer, and this is something you need to understand if you want to understand anything about the Janissaries at all. The prayer is real. It is not performed. Whatever you were before you arrived here, whatever your name was in the village, whatever god your family spoke to before the officials came, you are Muslim now. This is not complicated, officially. The conversion happened, the prayers are said. But the relationship between the official version of a person and the internal version is always more textured than any institution wants to acknowledge. And a barracks full of boys taken from their homes and remade into something new is, if you look at it honestly, a place where that texture runs very deep. You pray with the others. The words have become part of your body the same way the morning routine has, absorbed through repetition until they feel native. Whether they feel native in the deepest sense is a question that belongs to you alone, in the space between sleeping and waking where no one else can reach. Then the training begins, and this is where the day stops being about comfort or meaning, or the internal life of anyone involved, and becomes something much simpler. Your body is a tool. The training is the process of making that tool more precise. The courtyard is wide and open, and gives nothing in the way of shade, which becomes relevant quickly. The drill masters, the men who have survived this system long enough to be given authority over the next group of boys entering it, move through the space with a certainty that suggests they have decided to stop finding anything surprising. They have seen every possible version of failure and incompetence, and have long since made peace with the fact that it will keep arriving. What they are waiting for, patient as stone, is the moment it stops, the moment you stop failing, the moment the body does what it is supposed to do without the mind having to beg it. Archery first. You have been doing this long enough that your fingers know the string before your eyes adjust to the light. You knock the arrow and breathe and let the breath out slowly in the way you were taught, the way that was drilled into you through so many repetitions that the process has become something close to instinct. The target is across the courtyard. You release. The arrow lands, not where you wanted it, but close enough that the drill master does not stop to address you personally, which is the closest thing to praise you are likely to receive today. There is a boy 2 positions to your left who cannot seem to stop anticipating the release. His shots arc wide every time, and you can see him growing tighter with each one, the way muscles tighten when the mind tries to force an outcome that the body has not yet learned to produce naturally. You recognize that tightness. You lived in it for the first several months. You're not certain you're entirely out of it, but you are further from the entrance than you were, and that is the only direction that matters. The sword drills come after. The wooden practice swords are heavier than they should be, by design, so that when you eventually hold a real blade it will feel lighter than expected, your muscles already prepared for more than is being asked of them. This is a consistent theme in Janissary training. Everything is heavier, harder, longer than it needs to be, so that the real version of it, when it arrives, comes as a relief. The body calibrated to difficulty finds the merely difficult manageable. You have been calibrated for years. You are still being calibrated now. Your arms burn by mid-morning, not in a way that stops you, in a way that has become so familiar it functions almost as information, a signal that the work is being done, that something is being built. You have stopped thinking of pain as an event. It is just the weather of this life, present most of the time, severe some of the time, and occasionally absent in a way that you notice precisely because the absence is unusual. The drill master walks behind you and places one hand at the back of your shoulder, adjusting the angle of your stance without speaking. You correct it. He moves on. This is the whole of the feedback system. No explanation, no praise, no particular warmth. Just the correction, and then the expectation that you absorbed it, and then the next correction when it is required. You have learned more from this method than you learned in years of being told what to do in full sentences. There is something efficient about it that you respect even when you resent it. By midday, you are eating again, more soup, different bread. The conversation, where it exists, is quiet and focused. Men talking about the afternoon's training, about someone who struggled with the pike formations yesterday, about news from other parts of the empire that filters into the barracks in fragments and rumour. The Janissaries are not isolated from the world. They are very much in it. The world comes to them in the form of campaigns and orders, and the occasional restructuring of who reports to whom and what that will mean for everyone below. You have learned to listen for these shifts. In a system like this, information is another form of currency, and the men who understand what is happening before it is announced are the ones who are not surprised by its consequences. The afternoon is heavier than the morning in every sense. The sun has committed itself fully to the proceedings by now, pressing down on the courtyard with a kind of institutional determination. You are running. You have been running for what feels like long enough that your body has entered a different relationship with the act, where running stops being something you choose and becomes something that is simply happening to you while you remain technically in charge. Your lungs are making decisions without consulting you. Your legs are negotiating among themselves. You're along for the information. The older Janissaries have a way of watching you that is not unfriendly but is not warm. It is the particular attention of people who are assessing something, tallying up what it can do, calculating what it is likely to cost if it fails. You have been assessed this way since you arrived. At first, it was unsettling, the feeling of being sized up rather than seen. Now you have learned to read it as a kind of respect, or rather, as the specific predecessor to respect that exists before respect has been earned. They are not dismissive. They are waiting. And waiting, in a system that takes the long view of human development, with the patience of an institution that has been refining itself for generations, is itself a form of acknowledgement. You are worth waiting for. That is not nothing. What you're building here is something the Empire has thought about carefully. Not your character exactly, though character is certainly being shaped in the process. What is being built is a body of reliable men. Reliability, in the context of the Ottoman military, is a specific and demanding thing. It does not mean simply doing what you're told. Any frightened person can follow an order. Reliability means doing what you're told under conditions that make doing anything seem impossible. It means holding your position when every signal your nervous system is sending suggests moving. It means being the thing that stands between the situation and chaos when chaos seems like the obvious outcome. The Empire spent centuries learning the difference between soldiers who could fight in good conditions and soldiers who remained functional when the conditions stopped being good. The Janissaries were the answer to that lesson. The corps was organised in units called ortas, each with its own identity, its own traditions, its own accumulated culture that ran alongside the official military structure. You belonged to your orta in a way that was, if you were honest, more immediate than your relationship to the Empire itself. The Empire was large and abstract and present in your life, mostly as a system of requirements and provisions. Your orta was the 20 or 30 men you trained with, ate with, slept near, and would stand beside when the standing beside became something other than a drill. You knew their weaknesses, they knew yours. The knowledge was not ammunition, it was protection. Because in a formation, your weakness was everyone's problem, which meant everyone had a direct interest in ensuring that you did not have weaknesses that could be exploited. This interdependency was the real product of the Janissary system, and it was probably the most sophisticated thing about it. Loyalty to the Sultan was required, loyalty to the corps was mandatory, but loyalty to the men in your orta was organic, built from the ground up through shared suffering and shared routine, and the specific intimacy of people who have spent years being made into something together. When battle actually arrived, which it did for most Janissaries at some point during their service, the thing that held the line was not abstract devotion to the Empire. It was the much more immediate knowledge that the man on your left and the man on your right, were depending on your right arm to do exactly what it had been trained to do. There were days when you thought about the village, less often than at the beginning, but still. A particular quality of evening light, or a smell from the kitchens that echoed something very old, would open a door that spent most of its time closed. You did not resist this when it happened. You had learned that resistance made it worse, pulling the memory tighter around you like a net. Instead, you let it come and pass, the way weather passes, the way discomfort passes when you do not negotiate with it. The village was real. It was a real place that had contained a real boy with a real name. None of that stopped being true because the system had decided to proceed regardless. It was simply true in a different register, a quieter one, a frequency that the barracks life ran over without erasing. The question you did not ask, because asking questions about the system from inside the system was an exercise with limited practical value, was whether what was done to you was just. You had heard various formulations of the official position. The Devshirme as honour, the Devshirme as opportunity, the Devshirme as the Empire's mechanism for ensuring that talent moved upward regardless of birth, since the sons of Christian subjects were, in principle, equally available for elevation regardless of family status. There was truth in this, in the specific narrow sense that several of the Empire's most capable Grand Viziers and military commanders had come through the Devshirme and risen to positions that would have been unavailable to them in the worlds they came from. The system was real. The opportunities were real. The elevation was real. The other thing that was real was that you had not been asked. The boy had not been consulted about whether he wanted to be elevated. No one had presented the opportunity to the village and waited for a voluntary response. The system operated on the assumption that it knew better than the families it took from, and the families, who understood the consequences of resistance, largely proceeded on the same assumption. Whether the assumption was correct was a question that lived in the territory where you did not currently have time to think. The senior men talked sometimes about campaigns, not the ones in the official account, the victories and the distances covered and the territories added to the Empire's long list of territories. They talked about what campaigns actually required, the waiting, which was most of it, the logistics, which determined everything and were almost never discussed in the version that made its way into the histories, the specific hell of moving a large military force across terrain that had not been consulted about its preferences, feeding it, watering it, keeping it functional enough to be dangerous when dangerousness was required, the waiting for orders, the orders arriving too late, the orders arriving correct and then becoming incorrect because the situation had changed and the chain of communication was too long to carry the updated version in time. You listened to these accounts with the attention of someone who was still accumulating information. You were not going to be a new recruit forever. You were going to be a senior man eventually if you survived and performed adequately. And when you were a senior man, you would be talking to someone like yourself, a younger version, about the things that the official account leaves out. This was how the real knowledge moved through the core, not through the drill manuals, which existed and were consulted, not through the formal instruction, which happened and was useful, but through the accumulated informal transmission of what it was actually like, passed from experience to attention, in the long evenings when the day's requirements were complete and the night had not yet fully committed itself. You were paying attention. That was what you had understood, earlier than most things you had understood in this life. The attention was the job. Everything else was just the vehicle the attention rode in. The seasons changed inside the barracks in ways that the geography outside could not fully account for. Winter arrived not just as cold air through the stone walls, but as a shift in the emotional register of the place, a tightening, a drawing inward, as though the cause itself was conserving something. The drills continued through cold and rain with the particular stubbornness of an institution that regarded weather as an irrelevant variable. If anything, the worst conditions were treated as useful, additional calibration material, further evidence of what the body could be asked to do when the body's preferences were not consulted. You trained through rain that turned the courtyard into a slick, difficult surface that made the simplest movements require double the concentration. You trained in cold that made your fingers untrustworthy around weapons handles. You trained, on one memorable morning, in a snow that muffled the drill master's commands and required everyone to maintain formation by watching the man to their left and right, rather than by hearing the words. There was a kind of dark humour in the core that did not take the form of jokes exactly, but of a shared, unspoken acknowledgement that the situation was objectively difficult, and also probably going to continue being difficult, and that the most functional response to this was a collective shrug performed with straight faces. You learned to recognise this humour in the way senior men held themselves. Not defeated, not resigned, but dry in a way that communicated they had looked at the situation clearly and found it wanting and had decided to do it anyway, which was a different posture than optimism and a more useful one. The Janissary Corps had its own internal culture that was distinct from the rest of the Ottoman military in ways you came to understand slowly. The Corps identified itself in its own self-understanding as the household troops of the Sultan, which was a status claim that had political weight. Being the Sultan's household troops meant you were theoretically more loyal and more trusted than regular provincial forces, and it also meant you were more visible, more present, more capable of making your displeasure known if the relationship between the Corps and the palace stopped functioning to mutual satisfaction. This capability, the muted threat of organised discontent from the most capable military force in the empire, was not lost on anyone, including the sultans who commanded you. The Janissaries had, on several occasions in the empire's history, removed sultans they found unsatisfactory. The mechanism for doing so, a collective refusal accompanied by specific symbolic actions, including the overturning of the soup cauldrons that were the Corps' symbol of communal sustenance, was known to everyone and had been used enough times to be understood as a real option rather than a theoretical one. You thought about this sometimes, not in a way that translated into any action or any desire to overturn anything, but as a structural fact about the world you were inside. The Corps was powerful enough to make demands of the Sultan, and the Sultan was powerful enough to absorb those demands or respond to them, and the relationship between them was therefore a negotiation rather than a simple hierarchy. You were at the bottom of this negotiation, the body that demonstrated the Corps' value by performing its function well. But you were part of the negotiation. What the Corps was, you were part of. That meant something, even at the level of a young man who had not yet been tested by anything more consequential than drill. The other thing the Corps had was a relationship with food that was, in its own way, a philosophy. The soup cauldrons were not just symbols, they were the material expression of the Corps' self-concept. The Janissaries ate together. They were fed by the Sultan's household. Their physical sustenance was a statement about the relationship between the Corps and the crown, a daily reminder that the Sultan acknowledged his obligation to care for the men who fought for him. When the cauldrons were overturned, it was not just a logistical disruption. It was a symbolic repudiation of the relationship, a statement that the Sultan had failed in his obligations, and the Corps was refusing the terms of the arrangement until something changed. This made the food, the literal soup and bread of daily life, into something loaded with meaning that food generally does not carry. You ate the soup. You were aware in a low-level background way that eating the soup was a kind of affirmation, of belonging, of the relationship, of the ongoing negotiation that kept the system running. This was probably not what the cooks intended, but it was what the institution had made of the simple act of feeding its members. On the occasions when you were assigned to move through the city as part of a ceremonial procession, which happened several times a year at significant moments in the Ottoman calendar, the city's relationship to the Corps was immediately visible. People watched, not with fear exactly, though fear was present, but with something more complicated than fear, a layered awareness of what the Corps represented, its history, its capabilities, its political significance, its particular position in the Ottoman arrangement. Children who had been lifted onto their father's shoulders to see over the crowd looked at the Janissaries with wide attention. Merchants paused in their transactions. The street went quiet in a particular way, not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence, of something that commanded attention simply by being there. You marched through this attention and kept your face arranged correctly and thought, as you occasionally did during the formal occasions that required a certain deliberate blankness of expression, about what it meant to be the thing being watched. You had spent your training learning to be inside the Corps, absorbing its culture, becoming part of its function. Walking through the city in formation was the first time you experienced the outside view, the city's perception of what you had become. It was different from the inside view. It was not better or worse. It was just the other face of the same thing, visible only when you were moving through the spaces where the two faces could be simultaneously present. By now you had been in the barracks long enough that the early confusion had resolved into something clearer. Not certainty, exactly, You had not achieved certainty about the large questions, the ones that did not have answers available from the inside of the institution, but a working clarity, a functional understanding of the rules and the rhythms and the places where the rules bent and the places where they did not, and what the difference between those places meant for a person who needed to navigate them. This working clarity was, you had come to understand, what the training was actually producing, not just the physical conditioning, not just the weapon skills, but the internal map of a complex institutional world that would allow you to function within it without constant conscious effort. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The destination of all this was campaign. Everyone knew it. The Janissaries were soldiers, and soldiers were for war, and the Ottoman Empire at this period of its history was in a more or less continuous state of war somewhere on its borders. The wars were a long way from the barracks. They were described in fragments and rumour, and the occasional return of men who had been away and came back changed, in ways that were immediately visible and never fully explained. You had not been on campaign. You were being built toward it. The building was not finished. Whether you were ready was a question the institution would answer for you when it decided the answer was yes, and your own assessment of your readiness was, in the polite fiction of the system, not a variable in that calculation. You would be deployed when you were needed. That was the arrangement. You had agreed to the arrangement by virtue of the fact that you were here, which was not an agreement in any conventional sense, but was an agreement that the system recognized, and in the end the system's version was the one that mattered. The formation drills are where the individual disappears. This is the point. A Janissary fighting alone is a capable soldier. A formation of Janissaries fighting as a single body is something that has stopped entire armies. The Empire spent centuries refining this, identifying through blood and experience exactly how many men, in exactly what arrangement, with exactly what timing, could hold a line that should not have held, could break a position that should not have broken, could present the world with a wall of coordinated violence that had been specifically designed to make walls unnecessary. You are one small piece of this larger calculation. Your job is not to be exceptional individually. Your job is to be reliable collectively. Exceptional individuals are useful. Reliable units win. You move through the formations, the voices of the drill masters cutting across the courtyard, with the particular quality of sound that stops being heard and starts being obeyed. Left, advance, hold, turn. The body does it before the mind registers the instruction. That is when you know the training is working, not when you think about the right thing to do, when you have stopped having to think about it at all. There is a moment, somewhere in the middle of the afternoon, when everything hurts at the same consistent level, and the sun has settled into its most aggressive angle, and you are holding a position in the formation that requires both legs to do things they were not originally designed to do when something very quiet happens inside you. A kind of stillness, not peace exactly, not contentment, but something like the absence of resistance. The body is doing what it was built to do. The mind has stopped arguing, the system is running, and you are, in some technical sense, exactly where you were shaped to be. You do not know how to feel about that. You're not sure feeling anything about it is the appropriate response. But you notice it, in the way you notice things in this life, quietly, without letting it show, filed away with everything else you have accumulated in here that has no name and no address and nowhere to go. Evening arrives with a mercy the afternoon declined to offer. The air cools, the drills end. You wash, if washing is the right word for what happens when a large number of people share a limited amount of water in a space designed for efficiency rather than comfort. You eat. The meal at the end of the day is the best one, slightly more substantial than what came before it, a small acknowledgement that the day demanded something and the body is owed something in return. There is meat tonight, you eat it without ceremony. You're too tired for ceremony. Ceremony is for people who have energy left. The conversation in the evening is different from the conversation earlier in the day. It is quieter, more personal, the kind of talk that happens when guards are down and the system has temporarily released its grip. Someone tells a story about where they came from, a village somewhere in the Balkans, green hills and a river that turned a particular colour in autumn. Someone else listens, someone else doesn't, already sliding towards sleep with the practiced ease of a man who has learned not to resist the end of the day. You lie on your mat. The stone floor breathes cold up through the thin padding. This is familiar. This is, in the only way the word applies here, home. Not the home you had before. That version of home exists now only in the worn smooth memory, the riverstone you have handled too many times to see clearly. But home in the sense of the place where your body knows how to rest, where the sounds are the right sounds, where the dark means something. You were taken from one world and built into another. The Janissary Corps did not ask your opinion about this. It did not offer alternatives or comfort you about the process. It simply proceeded, as systems do, with the calm confidence of something that has been working for a long time and sees no reason to apologize for it. What it gave you in return was real. The training, the structure, the belonging to something larger than yourself, the knowledge that you are not easily replaced but are also not irreplaceable, which is the specific emotional territory that most people inhabit for most of their lives. It gave you the bread and the morning prayer and the drill master's hand correcting your shoulder angle without needing to explain why. What it took, you're still in the process of accounting for. The village, the name that belonged to the boy who arrived here. The version of yourself that was built by people who loved you before they were taught by the Empire to love something else more. These things are not gone. They are just further away than they used to be. And the distance grows, gradually, imperceptibly, the way the horizon shifts when you walk toward it for a long time without looking back. You close your eyes. The barracks settle into the sounds of men sleeping, breathing, occasionally speaking in the low, involuntary murmur of whatever the brain does when the body finally lets go. Tomorrow, the drills will begin again. Tomorrow, the formation will need to be cleaner, faster, more automatic than today. Tomorrow, you will eat the soup and say the prayers and hold the line and be, in every way the system requires, exactly what you were made to be. But that is tomorrow. Tonight, for a few hours, the system has no instructions for you. Tonight, in the narrow strip of time between the last word of the day and the first word of tomorrow, you are almost something else entirely. You're almost the boy from the village, lying still, listening to the dark, waiting for a morning that belongs to him. It does not last long, but for now it is yours. There is a story that gets told about Hurrem Sultan, the woman who rose from the slave markets of the Ottoman Empire to become the most powerful figure in the Imperial court. More influential than generals, more dangerous than viziers, more trusted than the empire itself perhaps wanted to admit. The story goes that she must have used magic, love potions, witchcraft, some art unknown to ordinary women. Because how else do you explain it? How else does an enslaved girl from somewhere in Eastern Europe end up rewriting the rules of an institution that had operated on the same principles for a century? The magic explanation, to be clear, is not the correct one. The correct explanation is considerably more interesting and considerably more alarming, depending on how you feel about intelligence operating in a system designed to contain it. She was born sometime around 1500, in a region that is most likely what is now Ukraine or Poland, though the exact location, like many details of her early life, sits in the comfortable uncertainty of incomplete records. Her name before she was enslaved is not known with certainty. Hurrem, the name she would carry to history, means the laughing one in Persian, a detail that becomes either charming or quietly ominous, depending on what you know about what came next. She was taken into the Ottoman slave system, one of the tens of thousands of people who move through that apparatus in any given generation, and she arrived at the Imperial Palace in Constantinople, which the Ottomans called Istanbul, as a gift or a purchase, a person who had been converted into a commodity and was now being converted into something else. What she found when she arrived was the harem, and the harem was not what the word would later come to mean in the imagination of Europe. It was not primarily a space of entertainment or indulgence. It was a closed world with its own rigid hierarchy, its own politics, its own system of advancement and punishment and informal power that operated entirely separate from the official court. And Hurrem, whatever else she was, understood power. She understood it the way some people understand music instinctively, without being taught the theory. She could see the structure of a situation before anyone else in the room had registered that a structure existed. The reigning Sultan was Suleiman I, the man history calls the Magnificent, which tells you something about the scale of his reputation and something about the distance between how rulers look from the outside and how they look from inside the rooms where they actually make decisions. Suleiman was intelligent, cultured, a poet in his private moments, and a man of enormous ambition that had been given enormous means to express itself. He was also, like every Ottoman Sultan, surrounded by an institution designed to keep the personal and the political in very specific, carefully maintained compartments. The Harem system was part of that institution. Slave concubines bore the Sultan's children, freed women did not. Wives, in the formal sense, did not really exist. Not in the Ottoman Imperial household, not for sultans. The arrangement was calculated to prevent any single woman from accumulating the kind of status that would give her political leverage. Hurrem dismantled that calculation so completely that historians are still, several centuries later, arguing about how she did it. She began by becoming impossible to ignore, not through beauty alone, though by all accounts she was striking, but through the particular combination of wit, warmth, and strategic intelligence that makes a person feel, in the presence of another person, that they have been genuinely seen. Suleiman, surrounded by flattery and ceremony and the perpetual performance of everyone who wanted something from him, encountered in Hurrem someone who seemed to want his actual attention. Whether that was strategy or genuine feeling, or some combination of both that even Hurrem herself could not have fully disentangled, is a question the historical record cannot answer, and might be the wrong question anyway. The effect was real regardless of its origin. He wrote her poetry. This is a documented fact remarkable in itself because Ottoman sultans were not in the habit of writing poetry to their concubines. He addressed her in letters that survive to this day, letters of a warmth and personal directness that have made historians uncomfortable in the best possible way, because they do not fit the expected pattern at all. Something was happening here that the institution was not designed to accommodate. And then something occurred that had not happened in the Ottoman imperial household in living memory. Suleiman freed Hurrem from slave status and married her, formally, legally, in a ceremony. He made her his legitimate wife, his Haseki, a title that had no real precedent and which had to be, in some sense, invented around her, because the existing categories were not sufficient. The response at court was, to put it gently, not congratulatory. The chief of the harem, the woman who had held that position of enormous behind-the-scenes power, was furious. She had her own ambitions, her own networks, her own understanding of how the institution was supposed to work and who was supposed to benefit from it. Hurrem's rise was not just unexpected, it was structural. It changed who had access to the Sultan, which changed who had influence over decisions, which changed everything downstream from that. Political power in the Ottoman court did not flow from official titles alone. It flowed from proximity, from trust, from the private conversations that preceded the public ones, and Hurrem had reoriented all of that around herself. The conflict between Hurrem and Mahidevran Sultan, the mother of Suleiman's eldest son, and the woman who had considered herself the dominant figure in the imperial household, became one of the longest and most consequential rivalries in Ottoman history. It was not merely personal, though it was certainly personal enough. At its core, it was a struggle over something much larger than two women's preferences. It was a struggle over the future of the empire itself, because the question of who stood closest to the Sultan was inseparable from the question of whose son would survive to inherit. The Ottoman succession system was, by any reasonable standard, horrifying. It operated on the principle that the empire required one clear heir, and that the most reliable way to ensure one clear heir was to eliminate the competition. When a new sultan took the throne, his brothers, half-brothers, and any other male relatives with a plausible claim were typically killed, strangled with a silk cord specifically, because noble blood was not supposed to be spilled. This is not a peripheral detail of Ottoman history. It is the central fact that explains much of what happened inside the palace, because every mother of a royal son understood that her child's survival depended on being the right child at the right moment, and that any other candidate was, from that perspective, an existential threat. Hurrem had sons with Suleiman, multiple sons, and the most obvious claimant for the succession was Mustafa, the eldest son, the son of Mahidevran, the son who had already distinguished himself as a capable military commander and who had the loyalty of large parts of the Janissary corps. Mustafa was, by almost every external measure, the natural heir. He was popular, he was competent, he was supported. He was also, from Hurrem's perspective, in the way. What happened over the following years involves a level of court intrigue so dense and so multiplier-tested, and so genuinely disputed in its specific details, that any single account of it risks oversimplifying something that defies simple summary. What is known is this. Hurrem cultivated relationships with the Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, who was Suleiman's closest friend and most trusted advisor, and then with Ibrahim's successor, Rustem Pasha, who was also Hurrem's son-in-law. She maintained a steady correspondence with Suleiman across his military campaigns, letters that were not merely affectionate but politically engaged, full of information and opinion about conditions at court and the behaviour of those around him. She made herself, over decades, the single most reliable source of information and emotional support available to a sultan who was frequently absent from the capital and surrounded by people with competing agendas. And one by one, the obstacles in her son's path were removed. Ibrahim Pasha, once the most powerful man in the empire after the Sultan himself, was executed in 1536 on charges that history has never fully clarified. Mustafa, the popular and capable eldest son, was strangled on Suleiman's orders in 1553, following reports which many historians suspect were shaped or even fabricated with Hurrem's involvement, that he was plotting against his father. The sources disagree about the details, they agree about the outcome. Mustafa died. Hurrem's sons survived. The succession moved in the direction that served her children's interests. Whether Hurrem was the architect of these events, or a powerful figure who benefited from them, or something more complicated than either of those descriptions allows, the historical debate continues without a clean resolution. What does not seem genuinely debatable is that she understood the game, that she played it at the highest level available to any person in that system, and that she played it in conditions that were, structurally, designed to prevent someone like her from playing it at all. She also did things that had nothing to do with court politics, which is itself a kind of evidence about the nature of her influence. She commissioned major architectural projects, including a complex in Constantinople that contained a mosque, a school, a hospital and a public bath. She built similar structures in Jerusalem and in Mecca. These were not private acts, they were statements, the kind that require resources and official sanction, and a public identity substantial enough to attach them to. She was corresponding with the King of Poland. She was, in some documented sense, conducting diplomacy. A woman who had arrived as a slave was, by the end of her life, functioning as something that had no official name in the Ottoman system because the Ottoman system had not anticipated her existence. She died in 1558, still at the height of her influence, still formally married to the Sultan who had been writing her poetry for decades. Suleiman mourned her in a way that the court found, by all accounts, both genuine and slightly destabilizing. He had her buried in a mausoleum attached to the mosque she had commissioned, which was itself attached to his own projected tomb, an architectural statement about proximity and permanence that she had arranged before her death with the same attention to consequence that characterized everything she did. What she leaves behind is not a simple story. It is not the story of a woman who triumphed over adversity through virtue. It is the story of a woman who understood a brutal system with ruthless clarity, who operated within its rules while quietly bending as many of them as she could reach, who accumulated real power in a world that had been specifically designed to ensure she could not, and who did all of this in an institution that would spend the next 2 centuries trying to figure out what had happened and how to prevent it from happening again. They never quite managed it, but they did try. What the attempts at management produced, more than they produced any actual limitation of the harem's influence, was documentation. The various reform efforts of the 17th century, the adjustments to succession law, the attempts to formalize the valid sultan's role in ways that might also limit it, generated a paper trail that allows historians to reconstruct, in more detail than is available for most Ottoman institutional arrangements, exactly how the system functioned and exactly what made it so resistant to modification. The documentation is, in its way, an inadvertent monument to the people the reforms were designed to contain. Hurrem herself left a paper trail that was unusual for a woman in her position, and unusual for a woman in almost any position in the 16th century. Her letters to Suleiman survive. They are warm, specific, politically engaged, and occasionally contain passages of such direct personal honesty that they have made historians put them down for a moment before continuing. She was not performing sentiment. She was using it in the way that intelligent people who are good at relationships use genuine feeling as a foundation for trust, because genuine feeling, unlike performed feeling, is harder to dismiss and harder to forget. The thing that is easiest to miss in accounts of Hurrem's rise is how long it took and how much of it was invisible. The dramatic moments, the formal marriage, the building commissions, the succession manoeuvring, these are the things that appear in the record. What does not appear in the record is the years of daily work that preceded them, the careful management of relationships with people who could be useful, the deliberate construction of a reputation for loyalty, intelligence, and good judgment that made her indispensable in contexts beyond the personal, the slow accumulation of information about court dynamics, about who mattered and who was pretending to matter, about where the real pressure points were and how much pressure they could bear before they moved. This kind of work is invisible in historical records not because it was unimportant, but because it is not the kind of thing that generates documents. It generates relationships and reputations and tacit understandings, and the gradual reorientation of everyone around you toward the conclusion that you are necessary. By the time Hurrem was visible enough to appear in the formal record as a significant political actor, she had already been doing the actual work of political significance for years. The visibility was a symptom, not the event itself. It is worth pausing here on what she gave up. Not in a sentimental way, but in a structural one. The woman who arrived in the harem as a slave, who had a name and a language and a family and a particular relationship to the specific geography of a particular place in Eastern Europe, did not keep those things. She converted. She took a new name. She learned a new language and a new culture and a new set of rules. She constructed a new identity from the materials the system made available, and she made that identity work so well that it eventually reshaped the system itself. Whether the original person was still in there somewhere, whether something survived the transformation that was older than the harem's version of her is not a question the historical record can answer. It can only show what she built, not what it cost to build it. The sons she fought for had their own trajectories. Selim II, who eventually became Sultan after Suleiman's death, and who is sometimes described in the historiography with phrases that translate roughly as not quite up to his parents' standard, ruled for about 8 years and was notable for his wine consumption, and for the conquest of Cyprus, which happened under his general's direction while he remained in Constantinople. The empire was large enough and well organised enough that it could sustain several consecutive rulers who were less exceptional than the infrastructure they inherited. This is what Hurrem built, not just a son on the throne, a throne solid enough that a less than exceptional son could hold it without the empire falling apart. There is a certain kind of achievement that only becomes visible in retrospect. Suleiman the Magnificent had a reign of 46 years, during which the empire reached its greatest territorial extent, its most sophisticated administrative apparatus, and its most significant cultural production. The historiography correctly identifies him as the central figure of that achievement. What the historiography is less consistent about is identifying the degree to which the stability of his court, the absence of the devastating succession conflicts that had destabilized previous reigns, and the particular quality of attention he was able to give to governance, rather than to managing constant domestic political crisis, were products of the personal and political arrangement he had with one specific person. Not the only person, not the only factor, but a factor that belongs in the accounting. She was buried, as she had arranged, in the mausoleum attached to the Suleymaniye Mosque, which is one of the most beautiful buildings in Istanbul, and which you can still visit today. Suleiman was eventually buried nearby. Whether proximity in death means anything is a theological question this channel is not qualified to adjudicate. What the arrangement communicates, as a piece of deliberate design, is that she planned her legacy with the same care she brought to everything else. She would not be a footnote. She would not be a scandal note or a biographical aside in someone else's story. She would be where she was, permanent, adjacent to the thing she had helped build, unmovable. She managed that too. The letters Suleiman wrote to Hurrem were not simply affectionate, though they were affectionate. They were the letters of a man who was using the act of writing as a form of thinking, working through his experience of the world in language that he knew would be received by someone with the intelligence to understand it fully and the discretion to keep it contained. He was a poet. He thought in images and metaphors that carried emotional weight in ways that direct statement did not. His letters to Hurrem are full of this, references to her as a spring garden, as fire, as the breath he required. This is not the language of political alliance. It is the language of someone describing a dependency that exceeded calculation. And yet Hurrem was also, at all times, making calculations. The two things, the genuine attachment and the strategic intelligence, were not in tension. This is one of the places where the historical record becomes interesting, because people tend to assume that feeling and strategy belong to separate categories, that love is not political and strategy is not personal. In Hurrem's case, and arguably in most cases involving intelligent people in high-stakes relationships, this assumption is simply incorrect. She felt what she felt. She also understood what those feelings produced strategically, in a court where the Sultan's private life was everyone's professional concern. She used the feelings and the strategy simultaneously, not because she was cynical about the feelings, but because she was realistic about the world in which those feelings. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The court's discomfort with this combination never fully resolved. As long as Suleiman lived, his attachment to Hurrem was a political fact that the court had to work around. After his death, the historiography that the court produced, and that European observers translated and amplified, went to considerable lengths to explain the attachment as something other than what it was: the magic explanation, the love potion, the manipulation of a normally rational man by a woman with unusual arts. These explanations were, to be clear, not offered by people who had evidence for them. They were offered by people who needed to explain something that their conceptual frameworks did not accommodate. A sultan who was genuinely, lastingly attached to one woman and reorganized an institution to accommodate her was not explicable within the framework they were using, so the framework invented an alternative causation. The historiography has been working to correct this for some time. Hurrem was not a witch. She was not unusually beautiful in some singular, inexplicable way. She was not in possession of arts unavailable to other women. She was a person with exceptional political intelligence and the specific additional advantage of being in the right place at the right moment, which is something that exceptional political intelligence can convert into outcomes that would not have been available to a less capable person in the same position. The other concubines who arrived in the harem alongside her, or before her, or after her, were not less deserving. They were not less interesting as human beings. They were simply not Hurrem. And the difference between them and Hurrem was not magic. It was the particular combination of capabilities and choices and timing that history, when it bothers to look honestly, almost always turns out to be. Her architectural legacy deserves more attention than it often receives. The Hseki Hurrem Sultan complex in Constantinople, built beginning in 1539, was not a vanity project. It was a substantial charitable complex that provided real services, medical care, education, support for pilgrims over an extended period. The hospital component of the complex was functioning for centuries after her death. These were not the actions of a woman interested only in immediate power. They were the actions of a woman who understood that durable influence required durable investments, that the most lasting kind of power was the kind that outlived the specific political circumstances that had produced it. The charitable work also provided a kind of public legitimacy that was otherwise unavailable. She could not appear in court in an official capacity. She could not hold a title that appeared in the formal administrative records with her name attached to governance decisions. But the foundation, the buildings, the ongoing provision of services to the public, these existed in the world with her name on them, and the name persisted after the politics that surrounded it had shifted beyond recognition. She had understood something that most of the men whose official authority exceeded hers had not understood as clearly: that buildings outlast reigns, and names attached to buildings outlast the people who built them. This long-range thinking, across time horizons that went beyond the immediate political moment, was characteristic of her approach in ways that become clearer the longer you look at the record. The decisions that seem most calculating in the short term, the manoeuvring around the succession, the management of her relationship to Suleiman during his long military absences, the architectural commissions that began before their purposes were fully achieved, all of them reflect a consistent orientation toward outcomes that were measured in decades rather than seasons. She was playing a long game in an institution that usually thought in terms of the current reign, and the long game is, in any institutional environment, extremely difficult to counter. The world Hurrem moved through was one of layers upon layers, official and unofficial, visible and hidden. The version of power that appeared in the formal record and the version that actually decided things in rooms where no record was kept. Understanding how that world functioned, how messages crossed the distance between one layer and another, how two parties who did not share a language negotiated the terms of their coexistence, requires understanding a figure who appears constantly at the edges of Ottoman history and almost never at the centre of its official story. Someone who was indispensable to everyone and politically trusted by no one. Someone who spoke all the languages and was claimed by none of the cultures. Someone who, if things went wrong, would be the first person available to blame. That person was the dragoman, and tonight you are one of them. You wake up in Constantinople, which means you wake up in the most crowded, most stratified, most linguistically complicated city in the world, and you wake up understanding all of it, which is both your greatest asset and your most consistent problem. The room you are sleeping in is decent but not impressive. This is by design. Dragomans who lived too well were viewed with suspicion. Dragomans who lived too poorly were not viewed at all. You have calibrated your visible life to a middle register that communicates competence without suggesting that competence has been too well rewarded. Whether it has actually been well rewarded is a separate question, with a more complicated answer. The morning light comes through a single window that faces an alley, which gives you a sliver of sky and a full view of the wall opposite, which someone has chalked with a message in Arabic that you translated the moment you woke up and have already filed under "not your problem." This is one of the peculiar conditions of your life. Everything in the world is, in some sense, addressed to you, because everything in the world is in a language you understand, the Arabic graffiti, the Greek conversation happening below your window between two men arguing about the weight of something being sold, the Italian being spoken further along the street by someone who sounds like they are from Venice, and is almost certainly at least partially lying about their intentions. You hear all of it, you absorb all of it, you respond to almost none of it, because the first rule of this profession is that understanding is a resource, and resources are not given away without compensation. You dress carefully. The dragoman's appearance was a studied thing, not ostentatious but polished, a visual argument that the person wearing these clothes was someone who moved between worlds without belonging fully to any of them, which was accurate. You are Ottoman educated, Greek by descent, fluent in Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Greek, Italian, and enough French to be useful in the right context. You have spent years becoming this. The becoming was not gentle. Your father was also a dragoman, and his father before him. This is not a coincidence. The dragoman families of Constantinople, mostly Greek Orthodox and Armenian and Jewish families who had maintained their presence in the city through the Ottoman conquest, and found in linguistic skill a kind of portable safety, passed their profession down through generations the way other families passed down land or trade connections. The children learned languages before they learned anything else. They sat in on interpreting sessions before they were old enough to understand everything being said. They absorbed, through proximity and repetition, not just the words, but the grammar of interaction between people who needed something from each other and could not ask for it directly. You grew up knowing that language was not just communication. Language was negotiation. Language was protection. Language was the thing standing between you and whatever was outside the door. The walk to the palace complex is long enough to be unpleasant and short enough that you cannot justify a palanquin. You walk. The city is already fully awake and fully committed to its usual productive chaos, the markets opening and the street vendors establishing their territorial arrangements, and the donkeys who are, collectively, the load-bearing infrastructure of Constantinople, expressing their professional opinions about the morning. You move through it with the practiced efficiency of someone who has made this walk hundreds of times and has learned to navigate by instinct rather than attention, which leaves the foreground of your mind free to prepare for the day. And the day requires preparation, because waiting for you, or rather waiting without waiting, in the studied posture of men who have decided to let their displeasure be visible without expressing it directly, are representatives of two different parties who need to reach an agreement about something that involves significant money, significant territory, and a long history of significant mutual distrust. They will speak to each other through you. They will argue through you. They will misunderstand each other in ways that are sometimes genuine and sometimes not, and they will expect you to manage those misunderstandings in real time while also producing an accurate and complete rendering of what each party is actually saying. What they will not do is fully trust you. Neither side. This is built into the position. The Venetian merchants, who represent a long series of interests that stretch from the Rialto to the edge of the Ottoman-controlled Eastern Mediterranean, suspect that your Ottoman education has made you inclined to favour the Ottoman position. The Ottoman officials, for their part, know that your Greek Orthodox family has maintained connections to Venetian networks for 3 generations and view your cultural affinities as a standing liability. Both assessments are partially correct. Both parties proceed anyway, because there is no alternative. There is no one else in the room who can do what you do. You arrive. You bow at the correct angles to the correct people. This is not mere ceremony, or rather, it is ceremony that is also substance. Because in a court culture, where rank and precedence and the management of small gestures communicate everything about how seriously you're being taken, getting the bow wrong can cost you an hour of recalibration before anything substantive can begin. You have not gotten a bow wrong in years. You practiced them until they became automatic, which is the only version of a skill you trust. The session begins. The Ottoman official speaks first, which was expected. He opens with formalities that are not merely perfunctory, but carry specific meaning, acknowledging the generosity of the foreign party in attending, noting the historical relationship between the two powers, establishing in the space of several elegantly constructed sentences exactly what the Ottoman position considers itself to be, and what it expects the other party to consider it to be. You render this into Italian smoothly, retaining the architecture of the original, which is important. Stripping the formalities out and delivering only the substantive content would be the fastest way to destroy the session before it starts, because the formalities are not decoration. They are argument. They are establishing the emotional and political framework within which everything that follows is supposed to be interpreted. The Venetian responds. His Italian is the Italian of someone who has been in Constantinople long enough for it to shift slightly, acquiring small Ottoman inflections in the rhythm of his sentences that he is probably not aware of. You note this because you note everything. You render his response into Ottoman Turkish, and here is where the first small decision of the day presents itself. Because the Venetian has said something that is technically accurate and diplomatically imprecise in a way that will, if rendered literally, cause the Ottoman official's posture to change in a way that will require 10 minutes of repair work before the conversation can continue usefully. The literal translation is faithful. The useful translation adjusts a single word, not the meaning, just the register, from a word that implies skepticism to a word that implies the same thing with a more neutral affect. You use the useful translation. You will make this kind of decision perhaps 15 times before the session ends. You will record none of these decisions. They will exist only in your memory and in the outcome of the conversation, which both parties will consider satisfactory and will attribute entirely to their own skill. This is the work. Not the language itself, though the language is the mechanism. The work is the constant real-time management of the space between what people say and what they mean, and between what they mean and what the other party can afford to hear, and between what the other party can afford to hear, and what will actually move the situation toward an outcome that serves everyone's minimum requirements. You're not a machine that converts words from one container to another. You're a person making dozens of judgment calls per hour, in a context where a single misjudgment can end a negotiation, damage a trade relationship, or, in the worst cases that live in the memory of everyone in your profession, start something that cannot be stopped. The worst cases are there. They are always there. You do not think about them during sessions, you think about them at other times. By mid-morning, the session has reached the section that will require the most delicate navigation. Money is being discussed, not abstractly but specifically, in numbers and percentages and dates and conditions, and both parties have arrived at this part of the conversation having spent the morning establishing their relative positions, and now each of them is negotiating from those positions in a way that requires you to hold the entire morning's architecture in your head while simultaneously processing new information. There is no pause, there is no break for the interpreter to gather their thoughts. The conversation moves, and you move with it, because falling behind is not an option, and being seen to struggle is an option that must not be exercised. You find, somewhere in the third hour, that you have entered a state of focused calm that you have come to recognize as the specific mental condition produced by this work at its most demanding. Everything narrows. The side conversations that are happening simultaneously around the edge of the room, the Ottoman official's aide murmuring something to his colleague, the Venetian's assistant making notes in a hand you could read upside down without effort, the general ambient noise of the palace complex pressing through the walls from outside, all of it fades to something you are aware of but not attending to. What you're attending to is the space between two men who are trying to reach an agreement and cannot speak to each other directly, and the thread you are holding that connects them. The session ends in the early afternoon with an agreement that is preliminary and conditional, and will require at least 2 more sessions to formalise, which both parties understand and neither will acknowledge explicitly. They address each other through you one final time, the closing formalities that mirror the opening ones, establishing in their gracious conclusion the same claims about the relationship that were established in the gracious opening. You render all of it. You bow again. You leave. In the corridor outside, the Ottoman official's aide finds you. This happens after session sometimes, not a formal follow-up, an informal one, the kind that does not appear in any record. He asks you, in low and entirely friendly Turkish, whether you had any difficulties. It is a routine inquiry, the kind every interpreter hears periodically. But there is something in the framing that is not entirely routine, a slight emphasis on difficulties, a pause after the word that leaves space for a response about more than difficulties with the language. You tell him, pleasantly and truthfully, that the session proceeded smoothly. You say nothing about the 15 small decisions you made. You say nothing about the word you adjusted. You say nothing that constitutes information about what the Venetian side communicated that was not already contained in the official record of your interpreting. Because there are things the Ottoman administration would very much like to know about their negotiating counterparts' internal deliberations, and there are things the Venetian merchants would very much like to know about Ottoman internal strategy. And there have been dragomans who provided both, sometimes simultaneously, in arrangements that ended with the dragoman in question ending in ways the profession preferred not to discuss. You are not that dragoman. This is a decision you have made carefully and repeatedly, not because the offers have not been made, they have, and not because the money was not real, it was, but because you have calculated in the cold-eyed way that your profession requires, that the value of your continued reputation for reliability is worth more in the long run than any single payment for betrayal. You are trusted by both sides precisely because both sides have concluded, through observation, that you cannot be bought. The conclusion is correct. What you did not advertise is that you reached it through arithmetic rather than virtue. This distinction matters less than it might seem. The outcome is the same. You are still in the corridor, you are still being asked the question, you are still saying nothing about the word you adjusted. The aide nods, he leaves. You continue down the corridor toward the room where your next appointment is waiting. Another session, different parties, same fundamental architecture of need and mistrust, and the space between them that only you can navigate. There are other dragomans in the city, dozens of them, some from the great families, some younger, some older, some working directly for the Sublime Porte, some attached to foreign embassies, some doing both simultaneously with the full knowledge of everyone involved and the willful ignorance of everyone who needed to believe otherwise. The world of Ottoman diplomacy ran on this labour. Without people who could move between languages and cultures and carry meaning across the distances that separated them, the empire would have been functionally blind to everything beyond its own linguistic borders. And the empire was not small. Its borders reached from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf, from the edge of Morocco to the Crimean steppe. Administering that required communication. Communication required people. People required their own complicated calculations about loyalty and survival, and the value of maintaining a reputation in an environment where reputations were the only genuinely portable asset available. You end the day in a coffee house, which is another innovation of this empire that Europe has not yet fully absorbed, though it will. The coffee house is a place where information moves, where rumour is refined into something that functions almost like news, where men from a dozen different communities and backgrounds sit in close proximity and pretend to be engaged only in their own conversations, while actually attending carefully to everyone else's. You sit here sometimes with the specific pleasure of someone who understands every conversation happening simultaneously in a room, and has chosen not to do anything with that understanding except enjoy the coffee. Tonight, someone 2 tables over is discussing a trade dispute in Greek. Someone at the bar is explaining something in Ottoman Turkish to a man who keeps nodding, while clearly understanding less than half of what is being said. Near the door, two men are speaking in a language that takes you a moment to identify because it is not commonly heard in this part of the city, and when you identify it, you make a small note of the fact that it is being spoken here and file it away with the other small notes that accumulate in this life, the small notes that are worth nothing individually and worth considerable amounts in the right combinations. You drink your coffee. The city moves around you, vast and loud and layered in ways that no single account can fully describe. You have been moving through it your entire life, speaking all its languages, holding all its arguments, representing all its interests to each other, and belonging, when you are honest with yourself, fully to none of them. You are the person between languages, between cultures, between powers that need each other and cannot quite manage it without help. It is not a comfortable position. It is not a safe one, but it is yours, shaped over decades by your own choices and by the world you were born into, and by the specific accident of having been raised in a household where language was not a gift, but a tool, and tools are made for work, and the work in question is this: standing in the space that opens between two parties who need to hear something difficult, and making it possible for them to hear it without the world ending. You walk home through the evening city, the muezzin's call from the nearest minaret catching the air above the rooftops and spreading outward over the water. Greek women are closing their shutters. A Jewish merchant is locking his door. An Ottoman soldier is walking his evening patrol with the steady, purposeful gait of someone whose job description requires a specific speed. You pass through all of it, and are acknowledged by all of it, and belong fully to none of it, and this is, if you let yourself sit with it for a moment, the thing that is most true about you. You are the translation, not the original, not the translation into anything in particular, just the act of translation itself, walking home through a city that exists in so many languages at once that only a person who speaks all of them can truly see it whole. There were moments in this career when the languages themselves became the thing you thought about, not as instruments, but as objects of interest. Each language you spoke was a different room in the world. Ottoman Turkish was the administrative room, formal and hierarchical and structured around layers of register and honorific, that encoded in every sentence the speaker's assessment of the relative social position of everyone involved. Speaking correct Ottoman Turkish to an official was not just communication. It was a performance of your understanding of where you stood, where they stood, and how the distance between those positions should be verbally acknowledged. Get the register wrong, and you had said something. Not something you intended, but something. The language would not pretend otherwise. Greek was the room where you were most yourself, which is something you did not always admit. Greek was the language of your family, of the stories that predated your professional education, of the particular cadence that your grandmother used when she was explaining something she considered important. You had Greek embedded in you before you had any other language, and it sat differently in your body than the acquired ones, looser, less calculated, more likely to produce the specific experience of speaking without thinking about the speaking. This was simultaneously comforting and dangerous. Languages where you were comfortable were languages where you were capable of being surprised by your own mouth. Arabic was the sacred language, which meant it was also the legal and philosophical language, which meant it was also the language of argument at its most sustained and precise. Arabic theological and legal discourse had been refined over so many centuries by so many exceptionally intelligent people that spending time inside it felt like entering a structure that had been engineered rather than grown. Everything connected to everything else. Every argument had a genealogy. Every position had a counterposition that had been anticipated and responded to, and then counter-argued in a chain of reasoning that stretched back to sources that were themselves responding to even earlier sources. You had learned Arabic for practical purposes, because the empire ran on documents that required it, but you had come to appreciate it for reasons that had nothing to do with practicality. It was a language that took the act of thinking seriously in a way that made the thinker feel, while inside it, that thinking was the most important activity available. Italian existed in several versions in Constantinople, and knowing which version you were hearing mattered. Venetian Italian was the language of trade and diplomacy, and a certain kind of confident pragmatism that believed every problem was ultimately a transaction, and every transaction was ultimately negotiable. Florentine Italian, when you encountered it, had a literary self-consciousness that Venice lacked, a sense that the person speaking was aware of the tradition they were participating in and was paying attention to how it sounded. Genoese Italian was blunter and more direct, and arrived in Constantinople trailing a long history of commercial rivalry with Venice that manifested in the specific register of competitive mutual dismissal that characterised interactions between Genoese and Venetian merchants in the same room. You could generally tell within 3 sentences which version of Italian you were hearing, and the information was useful before a single substantive word had been exchanged. Persian was the prestige literary language of the Ottoman court, the language of poetry and high culture, and the sophisticated register that educated Ottomans employed when they wanted to signal that they were engaging with an old and distinguished tradition. Suleiman had written in Persian, so had most of the significant Ottoman poets. The language. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The language carried with it an entire aesthetic inheritance from the Persian courts of centuries past, and using it well was a way of declaring membership in a cultural community that extended far beyond the Ottoman borders and far back in time. You had studied it partly because it was useful for court communication, and partly because the poetry was extraordinary, and you had decided early in your education that the poetry was reason enough. Languages did this to you. They opened things. Each one was an entry point into a way of arranging thought and experience that was specific to the people who had developed it over centuries of living in particular places with particular priorities. Moving between them in a single day was not just code switching in the technical sense. It was moving between different versions of what the world was and how it should be perceived. The accumulated effect of years of this movement was a certain difficulty in committing fully to any single version. Every position you adopted in one language could be translated into another, and the translation always revealed something, always showed you the edge where the concept in one room did not quite fit through the door into the next room. This was not distressing. It was clarifying. The edges were where the interesting things were. The families who produced dragomans had preserved this clarity across generations, which was both their strength and their limitation. They understood the edges. They lived at the edges. What they sometimes found difficult was the interior of any single room. The fully committed believer, the fully committed partisan, the person who had decided that one version of the world was simply correct and did not require the correction that translation always introduced. You encountered such people constantly in your work, on all sides, and you found them professionally useful and personally difficult to understand, not because certainty was wrong exactly, but because certainty that had never been translated, never been held up against the version in another room, seemed like something that had not been tested in the most obvious available way. The profession was ending slowly, not by any single decision but by the accumulation of changes that made the particular human infrastructure of the dragoman system less central than it had been. Printing presses were multiplying and spreading texts across borders faster than individuals could carry them. European powers were expanding their own diplomatic apparatus, creating permanent embassies with their own staffs who were beginning to develop the language skills that had previously required the dragoman families. The empire itself was changing, under pressures that were not yet fully visible, but were already shifting the ground. You could feel it, not in any dramatic way, but in the way that people who have spent their careers reading subtle signals feel when something in the signal pattern changes. For now, though, the work continued. The languages were still necessary. The space between parties who needed each other but could not speak to each other directly was still the space you inhabited, and there was something to be said for inhabiting it well, for being the person who could stand in the middle of a disagreement that had the potential to become something worse, and, by the specific act of translating carefully and precisely, and with the judgment to know when precision required adjustment, prevent the disagreement from escalating past the point where adjustment was possible. This was not a glamorous contribution to history. It would not generate monuments. No one was going to build a mausoleum for the dragoman who translated a trade negotiation slightly better than the situation required. But the trade negotiation produced an agreement. The agreement produced commerce. The commerce produced at the far end of a chain of consequences that ran through many hands and many years, something that would not have existed if the conversation had failed. You were one link in that chain, not the most visible link, but the one that connected the parts that could not connect without you. You had made peace with that, or rather, you had arrived at something more honest than peace, which was the acknowledgement that the contribution was real and the invisibility was the condition under which the contribution was possible. The dragoman who made himself visible, who drew attention to the adjustments he was making, who allowed either party to become aware of the mechanics of the process rather than just the outcome, was a dragoman who had stopped being useful. The invisibility was not a cost, it was the product. You were invisible because you were doing it correctly. The night city moved around you. The lights of the harbour were visible from where you walked, the boat's dark shapes on the water, the opposite shore a line of shadow that contained its own populations and its own politics, and its own complicated relationship to the empire that governed it. Constantinople sat at the edge of two continents and governed pieces of both, and the pressure of that position was visible in everything the city produced, in its architecture and its commerce, and its perpetual multilingual ambient noise, and the specific character of the people it attracted, who were generally people who had concluded that the edges were more interesting than the centres. You had been born here, on this edge. You would probably die here. The languages would outlast you, of course. All of them. They would continue doing their work of dividing and connecting people who needed each other and could not always manage it without help. What would be lost when you were gone was the particular person who had learned to move between them with the specific quality of attention you had developed over a lifetime. Someone else would learn. Someone else was already learning. The families continued. The profession continued for now. The edge remained. The coffee house where you ended your evenings was not the only place information moved. It was simply the most comfortable location for one specific kind of information movement. The other kinds happened in more formal settings and required more formal management, and you had become, over years of participation in both, something of a student of the different registers in which political information travelled through Constantinople. Official information moved through documents, firman from the Sultan, reports from provincial governors, communications from ambassadors. These were formal, recorded, preserved in the archives that filled entire sections of the palace complex with the accumulated paper output of an administration that had been generating documents continuously for 2 centuries. The documents were important, but official information was not the most consequential kind. The second kind moved through ceremony. The Ottoman court was a place where ceremony was argument, the order in which people entered a room, the height of the chair someone was given, the specific formulas used in a greeting, the decision about which languages a communication was sent in. All of these were statements. They communicated assessments of status and intention and the current state of relationships that were as legible to people who understood the grammar as any explicit document. You had spent years learning to read this grammar, not because you were required to, but because it was everywhere, and ignoring it was a form of blindness you could not afford. The third kind moved through people like you, not just dragomans but interpreters, secretaries, messengers, the clerks and functionaries who moved between official spaces and between official languages, and who, in the process of doing their jobs, became conduits for a kind of information that had no official status, but enormous practical significance. What this party said privately before the formal session, what that official had indicated about his preferences in an unguarded moment, what the shift in a particular delegation's tone suggested about the instructions they had received since the last meeting. This information was not in any document. It was in the pattern of observations accumulated by people who were present in enough rooms at enough moments to begin to see the shape of the whole. You were careful about this information in the way you were careful about everything in your professional life, which is to say you treated it as a resource with defined conditions of use. It belonged to the process of your work in the sense that it made you better at what you did. It did not belong to anyone who asked for it in exchange for compensation. The line was not always as clear as that formulation suggested, which is why you thought about it explicitly and maintained it through deliberate attention rather than leaving it to intuition. Intuition could be bought. Deliberate principle was harder to dislodge. The families of the dragomans in Constantinople had developed, over generations, an informal ethics of the profession that was never written down and never formally taught, but was transmitted the way most important things were transmitted in these communities, through observation and example and the occasional pointed silence when a younger member of the family was about to do something that violated it. The ethics was not complex. It amounted to this. The dragoman's value was his trustworthiness, and trustworthiness meant the same thing to all parties simultaneously, which meant it could not be sold to any one of them without being sold to all of them. which meant the price was effectively infinite, which meant the rational choice was not to sell it at all. This argument worked on anyone who had a long enough time horizon. The people who made offers generally had shorter ones. They wanted the specific piece of information that would give them an advantage in a specific situation, and they were willing to pay for it because the advantage would be immediate and the cost would not be felt until later, if at all. The dragoman who accepted had made a calculation that prioritized the immediate payment over the long-term reputation. You understood the calculation. You found it unpersuasive. There was a man in your community, not a dragoman exactly, but someone who had worked in adjacent functions for most of his career, who was known, quietly, and without much said about it directly, to have made a different calculation at some point in the previous decade. He still worked, he was still employed. The work was different now, smaller, less consequential, the kind of work that no one would pay to corrupt because there was nothing in it worth the price of corruption. He was comfortable, probably, but the trajectory of his career described, for anyone who knew how to read it, exactly what the alternative to the principal cost. The curve was gradual, the destination was unmistakable. You observed it and filed it, like most things in your professional life, as information that was worth more than the effort required to acquire it. The language of commerce, which was the primary language of the negotiations you managed most frequently, was simultaneously universal and deeply particular. Universal in the sense that the structure of a commercial negotiation, the identification of what each party wanted, the establishment of what each party was willing to give, the management of the gap between those positions toward an arrangement both could accept, was essentially the same in every culture you had ever encountered. The specific terms changed. The ritual framing of the negotiation changed. The specific behaviours that constituted good faith versus bad faith, and the specific behaviours that constituted insult versus acceptable pressure, changed dramatically from culture to culture and had to be known in detail if you were to navigate them at all. But the underlying architecture of what was happening was recognisable across all of them. People wanted things. Other people had the things they wanted. A transaction was possible. The transaction required management. This universality was one of the things that made the dragoman's position, at its best moments, feel like something more than a professional role. You were participating in the fundamental human activity of exchange, not goods for money exactly, but the larger exchange in which human beings had always engaged, the exchange of what one party had for what another party needed, managed across the distances of language and culture, and mutual suspicion that prevented them from simply doing it directly. You were the mechanism that allowed the distance to be crossed, and the crossing of distances between people who needed each other was, viewed from the right angle, one of the more valuable things that could be done with a life. This was not a sentiment you expressed aloud. It would have sounded grandiose in a profession that was supposed to be invisible. But you held it privately, in the way that people hold the version of their work that keeps them coming back to it, even on the days when it is difficult or unrewarding or politically complicated. It was the reason, when it came down to the reason, that you were still doing this after so many years, still walking to the palace complex in the early morning, still managing the adjustments that kept negotiations functional, still sitting in the coffee house at the end of the day with a cup in your hand, listening to the city speak in all its languages simultaneously. Constantinople had been at the centre of the world, in various senses of that phrase, for longer than almost any other city. It had been the capital of a Christian empire, and then the capital of an Islamic one, and the transition had been less a rupture than a continuation. The same city with a different administrative layer, the Greek and Armenian and Jewish communities continuing to occupy their neighbourhoods, and practice their trades, and speak their languages as they had done before the conquest and as they were continuing to do now. The Ottoman superstructure resting on the existing foundations of a city that had survived every previous version of itself and showed no particular sign of stopping. You were one of the people who lived in the joints, in the spaces where the layers met. It was not always comfortable. It was never boring. And the view from the joints, the view of how the layers related to each other and what held them together and what threatened to pull them apart, was a view that was not available from inside any single layer. It was yours. It had been earned. You would not trade it for the certainty of belonging fully to any one of them. To understand what the Imperial Harem of the Ottoman Sultans actually was, you have to first accept that almost everything you think you know about it is wrong. Not slightly wrong, completely wrong, in the specific way that things become wrong when they pass through the imagination of people who were not inside them, but were very interested in imagining what was. The version of the harem that entered European consciousness in the 16th and 17th centuries, and that persisted with remarkable durability for several centuries after that, was a fantasy built on desire and projection, and the specifically uncomfortable combination of fascination and contempt that characterized European attitudes toward the Ottoman world. It featured passive, ornamental women in diaphanous clothing spending their days in perfumed idleness, waiting for the Sultan's attention. It featured luxury without purpose and confinement without function and pleasure without consequence. It was, as historical accounts go, almost entirely wrong in every significant particular. What the harem actually was a government institution, not adjacent to governance, not influencing governance from a comfortable distance, an actual working institution within which significant decisions were shaped, alliances were formed and broken, careers were advanced and destroyed, and the question of who would eventually sit on the Ottoman throne was actively and sometimes violently negotiated on a daily basis. This is not a revisionist reading. The evidence is extensive enough that the serious historiography of the Ottoman court has moved well past the fantasy version, and into a considerably more interesting analysis of how a closed hierarchical institution with no official political standing became one of the most politically consequential spaces in the empire. The answer, as with most things in history, begins with structure. The harem was not one room or one corridor. In its mature form, particularly in the Topkapi Palace in Constantinople, which became the administrative centre of the empire from the mid-15th century onward, it was a complex of interconnected spaces. Hundreds of rooms, courtyards, baths, living quarters, prayer rooms, training spaces, administrative offices, audience halls of various sizes for various types of interaction. At its height, it housed somewhere between several hundred and 1,000 women, along with the eunuchs who administered it, and the vast supporting staff required to maintain a residential and administrative complex of that scale. It was, in practical terms, a city within a city, operating according to its own laws, its own economy, and its own deeply ramified power structures. At the formal top of this hierarchy was the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother. This was the most powerful position available to a woman in the Ottoman state, and the word position understates it considerably. The Valide Sultan's authority within the harem was absolute, which meant her authority over the harem's political output was substantial, which meant her influence on the Sultan himself, filtered through the machinery of access and information that the harem controlled, was real and documented and openly understood by the viziers and officials of the outer court who had to negotiate with it regularly. When a new sultan came to the throne, his mother came with him. If she was still living, she moved from wherever she had been kept during the previous sultan's reign into the Valide Sultan's apartments, which were the largest and best appointed in the complex, and she assumed control of an institution that had already been running in her direction for years, because everyone in the harem who had ambitions of their own understood that the woman closest to the future sultan was the woman worth cultivating a relationship with long before that future arrived. The Valide Sultan managed the internal politics of the harem in ways that could be gentle or brutal depending on the circumstances. She controlled who had access to the sultan and when. She managed the advancement of concubines whose sons she favoured, and the suppression of those whose sons she did not. She received petitions from officials of the outer court who needed something from her influence, and could not obtain it through official channels, which was a considerable number of officials with a considerable number of needs. She conducted correspondence with foreign rulers. She commissioned buildings. She endowed charitable foundations. She existed officially in a space that had no recognised political standing and exercised, practically, a level of political power that many officially recognised political figures would have found enviable. Below the Valide Sultan, the hierarchy descended through several carefully maintained ranks, each with its own titles, its own privileges, its own specific relationship to the Sultan's household and the Sultan's person. The Haseki, the Sultan's favoured concubine or concubines, occupied a special category that could exist in tension with the Valide Sultan's authority, or in alignment with it depending on the specific personalities and the specific moment. Below them were the Gozd, the women who had attracted the Sultan's notice without yet becoming mothers of his children, and below them the Odalisks, women of the harem who served as attendants, and who had not yet been elevated to any particular category of the Sultan's attention. The eunuchs who administered the physical space of the harem were themselves divided into a hierarchy. The chief black eunuch, the Kislar Agassi, was one of the most powerful figures in the entire Ottoman administration, not a marginal functionary but someone who controlled physical access to the harem, managed its internal economy, and served as a critical communication channel between the harem's political machinery and the outer court. The Kislar Agassi carried messages, facilitated audiences, administered enormous budgets, and accumulated over the course of a career a breadth of information about the inner workings of the empire that made him valuable to everyone and dangerous to cross. What is harder to find in the official record and more interesting because of that difficulty is the texture of daily political life inside this institution. The negotiations that happened in courtyards during the brief windows when the spatial rules of the harem permitted informal gathering, the alliances built through gift-giving and small favours, and the strategic management of information about who was in favour and who was not. The very specific art of being present in the right space at the right moment when the Sultan moved through the harem's internal geography, an art that required both careful observation of his patterns and a willingness to arrange oneself in ways that looked entirely accidental. Women arrived in the harem through several routes. Some were captured in wars or raids, the military acquisitions of a conquering state. Some were purchased in slave markets, the human end product of the trade networks that ran through the empire and beyond it. Some were given as diplomatic gifts by subordinate rulers or by ambitious families seeking to establish a connection to the palace. Whatever the route of arrival, the women who entered the harem entered a system that immediately began transforming them. They were educated. They learned Ottoman Turkish if they did not already know it. They learned the Quran, etiquette, music, dance, embroidery, whatever combination of skills was considered relevant to their particular trajectory within the institution. They were shaped, carefully and over years, into the version of themselves that the system required. This education was real. It was not a decoration. Women who spent years inside the harem system emerged from it, if they emerged, with a genuine education that was in many respects superior to what was available to most people outside. The harem's internal schools produced women who could read and write and calculate and navigate complex social situations with a precision that most people who had never been inside an institution specifically designed to develop those skills could not match. The education was an instrument of control, designed to produce women who would function smoothly within the system. But instruments have their own logic, and women who were genuinely educated were women who were genuinely capable. What they did with that capability depended on circumstances that the system could influence, but could never fully determine. The mothers of the princes occupied a particularly complicated position. Every woman who bore the Sultan a son had acquired, through that biological fact, a stake in the future that was not transferable and could not be negotiated away. Her son's survival was her survival. His advancement was her advancement. His defeat was her destruction, not metaphorically but often literally, since the Ottoman tradition of killing the losing princes at succession included in many cases significant consequences for their mothers. This created a calculus that was not hidden and not subtle. Every concubine who had borne a prince was playing the longest and highest stakes game available in the empire, and she was playing it in an enclosed space with limited resources, surrounded by other women playing the same game from different starting positions. The strategies that emerged from this situation would be recognizable to anyone who has ever observed human beings in a competitive institutional environment with high stakes and limited transparency. Coalition building, information gathering, the careful management of relationships with the Kislar Agassi and the Valide Sultan and the outer court officials who could be useful. The application of pressure through the control of access, since a woman who controlled the Sultan's social environment on a given evening controlled to some extent what he thought about and who he thought about. The strategic use of the Sultan's children as instruments of demonstration, because a son who was visibly accomplished, visibly impressive, visibly the kind of son a sultan wanted to look at, was a political argument his mother was making every time the Sultan looked at him. What the historical record shows most clearly in the period when the harem's political influence was greatest, roughly from the early 16th century through the mid-17th, in what Ottoman historians sometimes call the Sultanate of women, is that the institution produced results. It produced sultans. It shaped policy. It influenced the appointment of grand viziers. It determined, through the accumulated weight of its internal politics and its relationship to the sultan, what the empire chose to do at critical junctures, and in several documented cases, what it chose not to do. The outer court knew this. The viziers knew it. The foreign ambassadors stationed in Constantinople knew it. The Venetians and Habsburgs and Safavids, who were negotiating with the empire at the highest levels, knew that the formal chain of command that appeared in official documents was not the only chain of command that mattered, and that if you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive, and that the institution behind the closed doors of the harem was generating its own version of governance that was unofficial, unacknowledged, and considerably more effective than the official version preferred to admit. Reform efforts came periodically, attempts to limit the harem's influence, to restructure the succession system, to reduce the Validi Sultan's de facto authority. Some of these efforts produced modest results. None of them resolved the fundamental dynamic, because the fundamental dynamic was not a policy. It was a structural consequence of enclosing the Sultan's most intimate relationships inside an institution with its own political culture and its own sophisticated population. Change the rules and the culture adapts. Change the institution's official standing, and the unofficial standing expands to fill the gap. The harem was not a problem to be solved. It was a feature of a system that had grown around it over centuries. The period that historians sometimes call the Sultanate of women did not emerge suddenly. It was the product of a shift in the Ottoman succession system that had been developing quietly for several generations before its consequences became impossible to ignore. The shift was this: sultans stopped taking their sons on campaign. It sounds minor, it was not minor at all. Earlier sultans had brought their princes to the military campaigns that defined Ottoman expansion, giving them experience of governance and war from an early age, and establishing their capabilities before the question of succession became urgent. The princes who survived this process arrived at the threshold of power having already demonstrated something. They had a record. They had relationships with the military. They had a version of public legitimacy that extended beyond the palace walls. From the mid-16th century onward, the princes were kept at home. Specifically, they were kept in a section of the palace called the kafes, the cage, which was as accurate a description as Ottoman institutional naming ever produced. Young princes lived in the cafes from early in their lives, surrounded by servants, educated by tutors, provided with companions and entertainments, and entirely, deliberately, completely removed from any contact with the world outside. They did not govern provinces. They did not command armies. They did not build relationships with officials or soldiers, or anyone whose loyalty might become relevant if the succession question arose. They sat, they waited, they were alive, which was the primary requirement, and they were contained, which was the primary management strategy. The reasoning from the empire's administrative perspective made a kind of sense. The devastating succession conflicts of earlier reigns, the wars between princes that had destabilized the empire at precisely the moments when stability was most needed, suggested that having princes who were powerful and connected was a liability. If they were kept isolated and powerless, the argument went, they could not organize resistance or build the factional support that made succession disputes possible. What the reasoning missed was the consequence for the people who eventually emerged from the cafes to rule. A man who had spent his adult life in comfortable isolation, educated in theory and experience in almost nothing practical, surrounded by people whose entire professional interest lay in not displeasing him, was not well prepared to govern one of the largest and most complex political entities in the world. The sultans who followed the generation of Suleiman were, with some notable exceptions, less capable administrators and less confident rulers than their predecessors. They were also more dependent on the people around them, and the people around them were aware of this. This is where the harem's influence expanded most dramatically. The Valid Sultan and the senior women of the harem were not inherently power-hungry in some psychological sense. They were responding to a structural opportunity that the cafes system had created. The sultan who emerged from the cafes needed guidance. He needed people who knew how things worked and would tell him, people whose interests were aligned with his success, rather than with undermining him. The harem women, particularly his mother, were those people. His advisors in the outer court might have their own agendas. His mother's agenda was explicitly tied to his survival and his effectiveness. She was, in the cold actuarial sense, the person most invested in his reign going well. The Valid sultans of the late 16th and early 17th centuries understood this, and they understood what to do with it. Safiye Sultan, the Valid sultan during the reign of Mehmed III, managed the court with such effectiveness that European diplomats wrote home about her with the mixture of admiration and alarm that characterized their communications about Ottoman power more generally. She received ambassadors. She conducted her own correspondence with foreign rulers. She was, in the assessment of the Venetian bailo who was watching the court at the time, the actual decision-maker on a significant range of questions that were technically the Sultan's prerogative. Kosum Sultan, who served as regent during the minority of her son Murad IV, and later of her grandson, is perhaps the most dramatic example of what this system could produce. She governed the empire in a genuine administrative sense during two separate periods of minority rule, navigating the relationship between the harem and the outer court, managing the Janissary corps when they grew restless, and demonstrating a grasp of imperial administration that would have been notable in anyone with official standing and was extraordinary in a woman operating entirely outside the formal structure of power. Her end, when it came at the hands of her own daughter-in-law, Turhan Sultan, in a confrontation over who would serve as regent for the young Sultan Mehmed IV. Kosum was elderly by then and had held power for decades, and she apparently could not imagine that the accumulated power of her position would not outlast the challenge. She was wrong. She was strangled in the harem in 1651, which was a sharp reminder that the same institution that had enabled her rise was also the arena in which she could be brought down, and that the rules of that arena did not change for seniority or past accomplishment. Turhan Sultan, who replaced her, was young, capable, and eventually effective, commissioning a major fortress at the entrance to the Bosphorus, managing a difficult war with Venice, and demonstrating over a long regency the same basic pattern that characterized the most successful Valid sultans. A clear-eyed understanding of where real power resided, and a willingness to do the unglamorous work of maintaining relationships with the people who held it. What all of these women shared, across their different personalities and different circumstances and different outcomes, was a relationship to the institution itself that was not sentimental. The harem was not a home in the domestic sense, not something to be loved or to find comfort in. It was the field on which they operated. It had rules, and the rules could be bent by people with sufficient skill and nerve. It had hierarchies, and the hierarchies could be climbed by people with sufficient patience and political intelligence. It had mechanisms, and the mechanisms could be managed by people who understood them well enough to predict their outputs. The women who were most successful at this understood something that the official history of the empire rarely acknowledged directly: that the institution which was officially designed to contain and manage women was actually producing, through the specific conditions it created, women who were considerably more capable of managing institutions than most of the men they were supposedly subordinate to. The cafes had insulated the princes from the world. The harem had given the women in it a comprehensive education in how power actually worked. The asymmetry between these outcomes was not accidental, but it was also not entirely intentional. It was what happened when you designed a system to serve one purpose, and it turned out to serve another purpose considerably better. The foreign observers who wrote about the harem did so, almost without exception, from the outside. They knew what they could see, which was the architecture, the guards, the formality of the institution's perimeter. They knew what they heard, which was rumour and diplomatic report filtered through the same cultural assumptions they had brought with them. What they did not know, and what the historical record only imperfectly recovers even now, was what it felt like to be inside. Not the fantasy of what it felt like, the actual texture of daily life inside an institution where you were powerful and confined simultaneously, where your influence was real and your freedom was entirely relative, where the work you did mattered enormously and would be acknowledged in no official record. We know it from the traces, the correspondence, the architectural commissions that survive, the charitable foundations that still function in some form, endowed by women who apparently understood that the most durable form of power was the kind attached to physical structures and ongoing institutions. We know it from the patterns of decision that the reigns produced, from the moments when a young sultan's policies suddenly aligned with what a senior woman of the harem had been arguing for months, from the appointments of viziers whose careers were traceable to harem patronage networks. We know it, in other words, not from confessions or official acknowledgements, but from the oblique, partial, imperfect evidence that history always offers about the people it was least prepared to document. This is, in a way, the condition of most history. The people who most shape the texture of daily life and the direction of major events are often the people the official record was least designed to capture. The dragoman, the Janissary recruit, the woman in the harem who knew which door to stand near and when. Their contributions run through the record like veins through stone, present, load-bearing, invisible unless you know how to look. The education of harem women, which the official image consistently underrepresented or ignored entirely, was in practice one of the most extensive and rigorous programs of female education available anywhere in the Ottoman world, and probably more systematic than most of what was available to women in the European courts that were simultaneously fantasizing about the harem as a place of ignorant indolence. The curriculum was not accidental. It was the product of an institution that had been refining its own methods for generations, with the specific goal of producing women who were capable of functioning effectively in a highly demanding environment. The basics: literacy in Ottoman, Turkish, Arabic, and often Persian. The Quran, studied seriously rather than merely memorized. Music, which in the Ottoman court tradition was a sophisticated art form with its own theoretical framework. Etiquette, which at the level the harem required was essentially a complete course in the social grammar of Ottoman courtly culture, every gesture and silence and spacing of words carrying meaning that had to be known and managed precisely. Embroidery and other textile arts, which sounds decorative but required considerable technical sophistication, and produced work that was valued as artistic output in its own right. And then the more informal education, the observation of court dynamics, the study of who held what kind of influence and how they had acquired it, and what they were doing to maintain it, that was transmitted between women in the harem through the kind of informal apprenticeship that all institutions where real knowledge matters eventually produce. The women who arrived in the harem came from an enormous range of backgrounds. Some came from regions with strong literary and intellectual traditions. Some arrived already educated to a level that the harem's formal curriculum would only deepen. Some arrived knowing nothing of Ottoman culture and had to acquire everything simultaneously: the language and the religion and the social codes and the political geography of the world they now lived in. The harem absorbed all of them into the same institutional trajectory, producing, over years of consistent attention, people who were considerably more capable than their official status suggested. What the institution did not consistently do was acknowledge this capability. The official description of harem women was decorative. The actual practice of the institution was developmental. The gap between these two descriptions was one of the most consistently maintained fictions in Ottoman court culture, maintained because both sides had reasons to maintain it. The court had reasons to describe the harem as a space of beauty and passivity, rather than politics and capability, because the alternative description was destabilizing. The women of the harem had reasons to allow the description to persist, because operating in an environment where your actual capabilities are systematically underestimated is, in competitive terms, an advantage. You can do more than expected, which means you can be more effective than anyone is prepared to counter. The eunuchs who administered the harem's physical operations occupied a position that was peculiar even by the peculiar standards of Ottoman court life. They were male, which should have excluded them from the harem's domestic space. They were not, in the full social sense, men, which in the Ottoman understanding of gender and status placed them in a category that the official hierarchy had to create special accommodations for. The chief black eunuch, the Kislar Agasi, was formally ranked within the court hierarchy in a way that reflected his actual political importance, which was considerable. He had audiences with the Sultan that the Grand Vizier could not always obtain. He controlled information flows between the harem and the outer court with a precision that made him, in practical terms, one of the most significant power brokers in the empire. The eunuchs who served in lower-ranking capacities within the harem were similarly positioned between categories, men by birth and something else by institutional assignment, living inside the harem's physical boundaries, while serving the harem's administrative functions. Their loyalty was supposed to be to the institution, and through it to the Sultan. But loyalty is a human attribute, and human beings who spend their entire professional lives inside one institution and one social world tend to develop loyalties to the people they are closest to, which meant loyalties to the senior women of the harem, and those loyalties were a resource that the senior women managed with the same care they brought to all their other resources. The accounts of harem life that survive from women who are inside it are few and imperfect, filtered through the conditions of their production and the interests of whoever preserved them. What they convey, collectively, is an environment of intense social concentration. The physical space was confining, the population was dense, the stakes of social success or failure were high. In conditions like this, human beings develop extremely refined social perceptions, a sensitivity to shifts in mood and tone and interpersonal dynamic that people in less concentrated environments do not require, and therefore do not develop. The women of the harem, by the time they had been inside it for years, had developed social perception of a caliber that was genuinely extraordinary, not because they were individually exceptional, but because the environment had demanded it, and they had responded to the demand. This refined social perception was part of what made the harem such an effective political machine. The Sultan's emotional state, his preferences, his anxieties, his reactions to specific kinds of information presented in specific ways, were known to the women who spent significant time in his presence with a precision that his official advisors, who saw him in formal contexts managed by protocol, could not match. The women knew what the advisors did not. They knew how the Sultan actually was, not how he performed being the Sultan. And in a court where the Sultan's will was theoretically absolute, knowing how the Sultan actually was, and knowing how to shape it, was the most valuable intelligence available. The question of whether this was manipulation or management depends on your conceptual framework. From inside the harem, it was management, the careful cultivation of a working relationship with a powerful person, the same thing that capable officials in every court in the world were doing from their own positions. The official court described it as manipulation, because the official court found the source, women in a space that was supposed to be apolitical, too threatening to acknowledge honestly. The harem women, with the pragmatism of people who had learned not to rely on official acknowledgement for anything, proceeded with the management and let the official court have the word manipulation. This is, in the end, what makes the harem worth understanding carefully, rather than glancing at from the comfortable distance of a simplified account. It was a space where the official story and the actual story diverged so dramatically, and where the divergence produced consequences so significant that you cannot understand the Ottoman Empire at its most complex and most interesting without grappling with it directly. The sultans who shaped the empire's history were not autonomous actors. They were human beings embedded in systems, and one of the most consequential systems they were embedded in was the one that existed behind the closed doors of the harem, producing its political outputs without official acknowledgement and shaping the direction of an empire without appearing in its official records. History has a long tradition of not quite knowing what to do with power that operates outside the official categories. The dragoman who spoke all the languages was not in the diplomatic record. The Janissary recruit who held the line was in the casualty lists, if he was in any list at all. The harem woman who managed the Sultan's emotional environment with the precision of a master politician was in the rumour, the accusation, the architectural commission, and the pattern of decisions that did not fully make sense without her. She was there, she was doing the work, the record was simply not designed to hold her. What it was not, to return to the beginning, was the passive, decorative, politically inert space that European imaginations constructed out of their own fascinations. The women who lived in it were not waiting, they were working. The work was unglamorous and often brutal and operated under conditions of extraordinary constraint, but it was work in the genuine sense, serious, consequential, politically sophisticated work, conducted by people who understood the system they were inside with the specific intimacy that comes from having no option but to understand it completely. The sultans who sat at the centre of this world, surrounded by the competing pressures of the outer court and the harem and the military, and the religious establishment and the empire's long and complicated external relationships, were not themselves simple figures of absolute power. They were, in many cases, men who had survived the succession by luck as much as design, who had been educated inside a system that taught them to trust no one without adequate reason, and who governed an empire that was too large and too diverse to be governed by any single will, however powerful. The Harem was one of the systems that managed the space between the official fiction of absolute rule and the actual reality of distributed, contested, perpetually negotiated power. Every empire that has ever existed has had some version of this gap. The Ottoman version was distinctive in its institutional sophistication, in the longevity of the structures it produced, and in the particular way it used the concept of the enclosed and managed private sphere to generate public political consequences. But the gap itself, the distance between what power claims to be and what it actually requires in order to function, is not particular to the Ottomans. It is the consistent condition of every large human organisation that has ever tried to run itself on the premise that one person or one official structure controls everything. They never do. Something always fills the space that official power cannot reach. In the Ottoman Empire, for several of its most consequential centuries, the space was filled by women who had been given every reason not to matter and had decided, in the specific quiet way that people decide these things when they have no other option, to matter anyway. And so tonight we have travelled through a world that was stranger, more complicated and more genuinely human than the version that tends to appear in the broad summaries. We spent time in a barracks where boys were being built into something the Empire required, which was a harder and more ambiguous process than the Empire's official account ever acknowledged. The Janissaries were, on paper, a conversion story. On the ground, they were a generation of children asked to become new people, while the old people they had been were not entirely available for consultation. That gap between what the system said it was doing and what the people inside it were actually experiencing is a gap that runs through everything we looked at tonight. Hurrem Sultan navigated that gap with a precision that continues to unsettle people who prefer their historical figures to fit recognisable moral categories. She was not a victim. She was not a villain. She was a person who understood the specific mechanics of a brutal system and operated within them with a clarity that most people who have far more resources and far more options never manage. She was also a person who almost certainly participated in arrangements that cost other people their lives. Both of these things are true. History rarely offers the option of ignoring either one. The dragoman walked a similar line, though at lower altitude and with somewhat less at stake personally. He was the connective tissue of an empire that could not function without communication across the distances that separated its languages and cultures from each other. He was indispensable and mistrusted in exact proportion, which is one of the more honest arrangements that any institution has ever offered to the people it needs most. He made his small adjustments and kept his own counsel, and went home through a city that contained more languages than any single person could fully absorb, knowing that his particular version of absorption was the closest thing to a complete picture that the city permitted. And the Harem, the institution that the outside world spent centuries misunderstanding in the same enthusiastic direction, turns out to have been something much more ordinary and much more interesting than the fantasy. It was a workplace. A competitive, dangerous, politically charged workplace with stakes that included life and death and the future direction of an empire, but a workplace in the recognisable sense. A place where people with different levels of power and different levels of information and different things to lose spent their days trying to influence outcomes in their favour, using whatever tools they had access to. That the tools in question included personal relationships and dynastic planning and the careful management of a sultan's emotional environment, rather than official titles and formal votes, does not make the work less real. It makes it more interesting. It makes it human in a way that official history, with its preference for named officials making documented decisions, tends to undercount. What connects all of it is the same thing that connects most of what this channel looks at: the gap. The gap between the official version and the lived version. The gap between what the system claimed to be doing and what the people inside it were actually doing. The gap between the surface, which was almost always impressive and was usually designed to be impressive, and the interior, which was almost always more complicated and was sometimes more honest, precisely because no one was watching it closely enough to require it to perform. The Ottoman Empire was not a mystery solved by the word strange. It was an enormous, durable, internally contradictory human project that lasted for 6 centuries and governed some of the most diverse and politically volatile territory on Earth. And it did this by being, in its most functional moments, considerably more flexible than its official image suggested. Flexibility requires the ability to absorb information and adapt. The dragomans carried the information. The harem absorbed and shaped it. The Janissaries enforced the decisions that followed, and somewhere at the centre of all of it was a sultan, sometimes brilliant and sometimes not, doing his best to govern something that no single person could really govern alone. The city of Constantinople, the city you have been moving through tonight in various capacities, still stands, Istanbul now, still stratified, still multilingual, still containing, if you walk through it at the right hour with the right kind of attention, layers of the world that was built there over centuries by people who did not expect to be remembered, and mostly were not. The Topkapi Palace is a museum. The Harem apartments are open to tourists who walk through them with audio guides and imagine usually the wrong things. The streets where the dragomans walked are still streets. The coffee houses where information moved are still places where information moves, by different mechanisms but the same underlying logic. History does this. It does not disappear. It settles. It becomes the ground that the present is built on, and if you stand still long enough and pay the right kind of attention, you can feel it underfoot, solid and complicated and considerably stranger than the textbooks made it sound. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. It is late now. Whatever hour it is where you are listening from, the night has progressed enough that the effort of the day has settled into your body, and your mind is beginning to release its grip on the details. This is the right time to let the Ottoman world recede, to let the barracks and the court and the corridors of the palace complex and the coffee house and the harem's closed courtyards all move gently back into the distance, into the category of things that happened and mattered and are worth knowing and can wait until tomorrow to be thought about again. The Janissary recruit is lying on his mat. He is not certain what to feel about his life. But the uncertainty is quiet, and the barracks are settling, and the night is doing what nights do, which is to make everything seem slightly more manageable than the day made it seem. Hurrem Sultan is writing a letter by lamplight. The letter is warm and political and precise and contains multitudes that will occupy historians for centuries. She's not worried about the historians. She's focused on the letter. The dragoman is almost home. He has one more street to cross and then he is inside and the door is closed and the languages of the day, all of them, can rest until morning. And the harem is quiet, or nearly quiet, the way that institutions are quiet when the official business of the day is done and the unofficial business is only just beginning to find its pace. Somewhere in a courtyard, two women are speaking in low voices about something that will not appear in any record. Somewhere in a corridor, a eunuch is carrying a message between two parts of a world that officially does not communicate, but actually never stops. Let it rest now. Let the city settle into the dark. Let the sounds of it, the call to prayer and the market winding down, and the water against the stone and the general ambient presence of 6 centuries of accumulated human effort, let all of it become something softer, something that asks nothing of you tonight except that you stay with it for a little while longer as you find your way towards sleep. You have been somewhere strange and real and genuinely worth knowing. That is enough for one night. Rest now. The morning will bring its own demands. For now the Ottoman world waits, patient and strange and exactly as complicated as it always was, and you have done the work of knowing it a little better than you did before. That is enough. What tends to get left out of the large accounts of the Ottoman Empire and what tonight has tried to restore in small ways is the scale of the human effort that held it together. Not the grand human effort of the named and documented, though that was real enough. The other kind, the daily accumulated, largely invisible human effort of people who understood the system from the inside and used that understanding to do what needed doing, without the official standing that would have made the effort legible in the formal record. The Janissary who held his position in the formation was not the named general whose strategic decisions determined the outcome of the campaign. He was the material reality on which every strategic decision ultimately depended. His training, his discipline, his cultivated ability to remain functional under conditions designed to make functionality impossible was the actual substance of Ottoman military power. The named general was the mind, the Janissary corps was the body, and bodies, as anyone who has ever relied on one knows, require considerably more attention and maintenance than the official account of any achievement tends to acknowledge. Hurrem Sultan's story operates in the same territory. The grand narrative of the Ottoman court, the one that runs through the official records and the diplomatic correspondence and the formal historiography, is a story about sultans and grand viziers and military campaigns and territorial expansion. Hurrem appears in the edges of this narrative as a biographical footnote to Suleiman, his beloved, his Haseki, the mother of his successor. What the edges cannot contain is the degree to which that biographical footnote was operating on the same plane as the main text, shaping events, managing relationships, making decisions whose consequences ran through decades of imperial history. The footnote rewrote the text. The record just had not been designed to show it. The dragoman is the edge case that reveals the rule. He appears in no diplomatic record as a primary actor. He is the name in the parenthetical, the identifier of the method rather than the method itself, translated by so-and-so, which is how his labour was marked when it was marked at all. And yet without him the diplomacy did not happen. The trade agreements that opened the Eastern Mediterranean to Venetian commerce, agreements that funded the infrastructure of the Renaissance and channeled the goods of Asia into European markets, were negotiated through people like him. The stability that allowed the Ottoman Empire to function across its impossible linguistic and cultural diversity was maintained, in part, by the daily work of people who moved between the languages and carried meaning across the distances that separated the empire's constituent communities. The maintenance was invisible because it was done well. Invisible maintenance is the most common product of successful human effort and the most chronically underappreciated one. And the Harem, the institution that generated more fantasy and less clear-eyed attention than almost any space in history, turns out to have been doing what human beings always do when they are given intelligence, high stakes, and a long time to think. They organised, they competed, they built systems for managing the competition, they produced outcomes that affected the world outside their walls in ways the world outside their walls was not prepared to acknowledge or even perceive. The fantasy about the harem was more comfortable than the reality because the fantasy was passive, decorative, politically inert. The reality was none of those things. The reality was women doing politics in the most demanding environment available, under conditions designed to make the politics deniable, and succeeding at it often enough that the empire's direction reflected their work, whether the empire's official account admitted it or not. This is the consistent thread in Ottoman history that the evening has followed, and it is a thread that runs through all of history everywhere. The gap between the official story and the actual story. The gap between the people who appear in the record and the people who shaped what the record describes. The gap between the image that power projects of itself and the reality that the people inside the image are living. Every empire maintains this gap. The Ottoman Empire maintained it with particular sophistication, and the sophistication was itself, in a strange way, a kind of achievement, the product of a long-running negotiation between the official and the actual that produced both. What you take from tonight, if you take anything, is perhaps this. The strangeness of the Ottoman Empire, the quality that makes the title true, was not primarily in its exotic details or its unfamiliar customs or the dramatic episodes of its court politics. The strangeness was in how comprehensively human it was, how recognisable the pressures and the responses and the gap between official and lived reality, once you looked at it from the inside rather than the outside. The boy taken from his village and made into a soldier, the enslaved woman who became the most powerful person in an empire, the interpreter who spoke all the languages and belonged fully to none of the cultures, the institution that officially confined women and actually produced governors. These are strange, yes, but they are strange in a way that is also somehow familiar, because the pressures they describe, the pressure of a system that needs you but will not acknowledge you, the pressure of loyalty to people and institutions that do not return it evenly, the pressure of understanding a world more clearly than the world's official account allows you to say, these are not pressures that ended with the Ottoman Empire. They are pressures that are recognisable in the morning, before coffee, in any institution in any century, and any person who has ever looked at the official story and known, from direct experience, that the official story was not the whole story. The whole story is harder to hold. It is full of people who left insufficient documentation and consequences that ran longer than anyone expected, and small decisions in corridors and in coffee houses and in the harem's courtyards at dusk that determined the outcomes of things that would be attributed to other causes entirely. The whole story is what history actually is, as opposed to what it looks like in the summary. It is worth knowing. It is worth lying still for, in the quiet dark, letting the city across the centuries settle into your imagination until it feels as real as the room you're actually in. Rest now. The city of Constantinople, impossibly old and impossibly layered and stranger than anything you were taught about it, will be there when you wake up, carrying its history and its stones, its streets still walked by the echoes of people who navigated it with less information and more courage than the official record gives them credit for. They did what they could with what they had. Most of them did more than anyone expected. In the end, that is the only story there is. Sleep well. Sleep, where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.